We're going to head on to our final pillar for the afternoon, for the day now. This is around capital and risk management. And I want to welcome up Rod Sims, AO, who's a professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University right here in Canberra, and a chair of the Competitive Research Policy Network at the Centre for Economic Policy Research, Paris. He's also the chair of Opera Australia. From 2011 to March 2022, he was chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Prior to that, he had a range of senior corporate and public sector positions. From 88 to 90, he was the principal economic advisor to Australia's then Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. Please make welcome Rod Sims, AO.
I was standing between you and drinks and dinner tonight. Look, thank you very much for the chance to speak to everybody today. When Fiona's invitation came in to talk about the role of competition in increasing productivity and how we get fairness in supply chains, they're two of my favourite topics, and the ag sector is one of my favourite sectors, so really appreciate being here. I think a really important issue for me is the problem with market power, and I think the whole country underestimates the problems that occur. You don't even need to, just the fact that people have got market power can inhibit behaviour, particularly in agriculture. I mean, if you're a vegetable producer, you're thinking about installing precision drip irrigation, you're not sure whether to do it. If there's any uncertainty that the downstream buyer is no longer going to buy from you or is going to change the terms, it makes it really hard to make that investment with any certainty. So the supply chain problems, the market power problems do affect innovation, productivity, and the economy generally. And as I say, I think agriculture is right at the cutting edge of all that. I'm going to talk about three things today: how we need to improve our merger laws, how we need to have a law against unfair practices, which I think is important to agriculture, perhaps more than any other sector, and I'll talk a bit about market power that governments create in infrastructure. So, just on competition, over 200 years ago, Adam Smith wrote the most famous sentence in economics. He said, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." Now, this, of course, is the reference to the invisible hand, regard to their own self-interest. Some have taken this to mean that companies will always act in the best interests of consumers. Now, this is naive and frankly silly. Smith clearly recognised that for the invisible hand to work, you need competition. Businesses not facing strong competition will act in their interest, but it won't be the interest of consumers. If you've only got one butcher, one brewer and one baker, you're going to have a very expensive dinner. It'll probably be late and cold. So a market economy needs strong competition. That's essentially what Smith was on about, for anybody who's read the book, many of which who quote the invisible hand have not. And farmers, I think, understand this issue better than any other sector that I've seen. Now, it's a key role of the ACCC to ensure that mergers and acquisitions do not occur if they damage competition and so harm the economy. Now, the ACCC does have some success in this, but it's almost always lost in court when its view to oppose a merger has been taken on by the merger parties and taken to court. We've almost always lost. Now, some claim that the fact that the ACCC's lost indicates that we get our merger calls wrong. No, that's not the reason. I think the better explanation is the courts are applying the laws as they see them in ways that were not intended. In a speech I gave in August 2021 as chair of the ACCC, I proposed two important changes to our merger laws. First, that the ACCC should be the primary decision maker, not the courts, and the ACCC's decisions can only be appealed to the courts on the basis of the papers in front of the ACCC at the time. Second, and this is really important, that there be a new deeming provision which says that where one of the merger parties has got market power, substantial market power, and as a result of the acquisition, that substantial market power would either be entrenched or likely to be entrenched, materially increased or materially extended, then the acquisition would be deemed to be anti-competitive and not proceed. Now, the agriculture sector saw an enormous number of mergers and acquisitions while I was there for the 11 years. And you'll all remember them. Just to mention a couple, JBS taking over Primo, then Rivoli, various acquisitions in the dairy sector such as Saputo taking over Murray Goulburn, numerous animal product mergers such as Zoetis taking over Durox, Landmark buying out Ruralco, Woolworths acquisition of wholesale distributor PFD, and so on and so on. Now, I'm not saying that those mergers would have been stopped if we'd changed the laws, but what I am saying is that those mergers all these type of mergers need much better scrutiny than they're getting now to make sure that they aren't damaging the economy and, frankly, aren't damaging the agricultural sector. Now, under our existing merger laws, we've seen a lot of consolidation in energy, telecommunications, rail freight, and many others, and often we've seen significant price rises straight after the merger happened. Mergers that we failed to stop in court, the court ruled the merger was okay, the merger happens, prices go up. If only we could have convinced the court that that was going to happen before it happened, rather than having to point to it afterwards. So look, there is an active debate now about our merger laws. I really would urge the NFF to get right behind that. Now is the time for that debate, and the NFF will be a crucial player in that. My second topic relates to fairness. So what can a farmer do if their produce is threatened with rejection unless the farmer, having already sent the perishable product to the buyer, is faced with a buyer saying, well, not sure I want this anymore, knock 30% off the price, otherwise I'll send it back to you. It being perishable, of course, you're in an impossible position. What if a major retailer threatens to discontinue buying unless pre-agreed terms are changed? What if the only available processor systematically biases against the farmer in terms of animal weight or fat content? Or if payment terms are excessive from the limited available buyers? I could go on, but you know the answer. The Competition and Consumer Act is poorly placed to deal with these issues. It frankly cannot deal with all the examples I've just mentioned. And such actions damage your ability to plan and invest. Those with market power gain, farmers and the economy lose. Now, sometimes people think Section 46, the inappropriately named misuse of market power, would help you, but it doesn't, because it is all about blocking a competitor, one competitor blocking another competitor. That's all it's about, so it doesn't deal with what its name implies. And then you've got provisions related to unconscionable conduct. But the hurdle for unconscionable conduct is so high, the examples I just mentioned would not qualify. So I think we need to address such behaviour through an unfair practices provision. And I should just add, most other countries we compare ourselves with, indeed all, have got this and we don't. We're the outlier. It's there in the EC. They've got quite specific prohibitions about what can and can't be done between those with market power and the farming sector. The US has got such a law, and Australia stands out as not having one. In the US, for example, an unfair practice occurs where first, the behaviour is likely to cause substantial harm to the affected party. Second, this harm cannot be avoided by the affected party. And third, the harm is not outweighed by countervailing benefits to consumers or competition. Now, consultation is currently occurring between the Commonwealth and state governments now on this provision. So now is the time to get behind it. It's a law change which is being pushed hard by the consumer movement because of the concerns about unfair practices between businesses and consumers. In my view, and I've stated this many times, I think the importance of the law is business to business. It's particularly the farming sector is very relevant, but a whole range of other sectors are, because we've just had unfair contract term laws passed, but that's only where you're dealing with standard form contracts. We've got nothing to deal with when you don't, and I think this damages our economy because it puts the smaller business in a very difficult position in relation to those who've got market power. So another law change I'd urge you to get behind. Now, lastly, just turning to infrastructure, I think privatisation of infrastructure went well in the late 1980s. That's where we privatised Qantas, the Commonwealth Bank and a whole range of other things. The reason they were privatised, and I was in the cabinet room at the time, was because the government felt these assets would do better in private sector hands. They just felt the government couldn't run them properly. And I think they were right. But over the last 20 years, privatisation has largely gone wrong, as governments have sought to maximise the sale price by limiting competition to the asset they're selling, and governments can do that, or selling a monopoly without any regulation whatsoever, knowing that the new owner would raise the price to recoup the large price paid for the privatised asset. And often the company that wins the bid for the asset is the one that envisages raising prices the most. They're going to take the gutsy step. We had Port of Newcastle, 50% increase in prices. The company doing that won the bid, and a whole lot of other bidders said, gosh, we didn't think we'd get away with that, so we didn't bid as much. Now, examples of this abound. They're just everywhere, and I could, but won't bore you with those, keeping in mind your drink soon. But the Victorian government did sell the Port of Melbourne, and as they were doing it, they tried to increase land rents by 800%, which of course massively impact importers and exporters. They also put a 50-year non-compete clause on the Port of Hastings, which is the next competitor port to the Port of Melbourne. Now, a bit of an outcry, we did get those things watered down, but you can see what their objective was. It was making money, not making the best use of the infrastructure. The New South Wales government recently sold the two competitor ports at Port Botany, Port Kembla, to the one owner, thus limiting competition straight away, and they inserted provisions in the sale agreement in relation to the Port of Newcastle that prohibited the Port of Newcastle from competing with Port Botany. So they deliberately created a monopoly to maximise sale proceeds. Now, that's been watered down a bit because of a bit of the outcry. But our ports are essential gateways, and most other countries want their infrastructure to benefit the economy. And of course, the best way to get efficient ports is through port-on-port competition, or indeed the threat of port-on-port competition. There's no threat to Port Botany because the government's guaranteed there won't be. So they can sit there knowing that they've got the monopoly. Now, as I say, that's been changed a bit, but the government intended to give a monopoly so that the buyer would pay an enormous price, which of course they did. But in Australia, we bias to treating our infrastructure as a cash cow rather than treating it as something that can benefit the economy. Another example is we've had the constant push by grain port owners, owning the export ports, to avoid any regulation, even though these ports are often privately owned monopolies where the owners favour their own marketing arms when allocating access to the port. This limits the ability of grain farmers to get the best price for their produce because one grain buyer has a privileged position. Only the farmer and ACCC voices have kept any regulatory role in relation to those monopoly grain ports. And I'm just amazed at how strong the voices are of those grain port owners in Canberra. So that's a continuing battle to fight. But just very briefly in my remaining time, one other battle that's coming up is the Commonwealth is constructing the Inland Rail at great expense. Currently, due to the fact that the ACCC lost a merger case, you've got one dominant mover of containers on the east coast of Australia. So if you want to send a container, here's the container, I want to send it from Melbourne to Brisbane, you can only use Pacific National. That is your only choice. There are other ways to do it if you're not using a container, but that's your only choice if you just want to send a container. And that's because we lost a crucial merger case, in my view, inexplicably. Now, the reason why Pacific National dominates is because it controls access to the ports, or the intermodal facilities in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. And when other competitors try to get in, they can't because they can't get access to those intermodal facilities. Of course they can't. If you were Pacific National, you wouldn't give your competitor access either. So they're not behaving badly, they're behaving commercially rationally, but they're in a particular position that allows them to exercise their dominance. So there's going to be a new intermodal facility at Moorebank. There's talk of new intermodal facilities in Brisbane and Melbourne, all to support Inland Rail. And my point is it is crucial that Pacific National has no role in controlling any of those facilities so that they are truly open access so that we can get competition. Because what's going to happen is Inland Rail lowers the cost of rail freight by about 30%. Now, one of two things are going to happen. If there's competition to move the containers on Inland Rail, that 30% will be passed through to the users of Inland Rail. If there's not, and Pacific National keeps its dominance, it's going to get the 30%. It's as simple as that. That's not blaming Pacific National for being anything else other than commercially rational. But the ability to deal with this is in the government's hands, and they don't have a great track record, but I'll keep jumping up and down. So, look, to conclude, I think Australia has, over recent years, lost its enthusiasm for competition. I think that's affected the dynamism of the economy, innovation in the economy. I think it also affects income inequality in the economy, which is another topic. But I think the group most affected by all of this is the farming community. The NFF's always been a powerful ally in these sorts of debates, and I would just urge you to keep being so. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rod. We'll get into some questions in a moment. I want to also invite Peter Arkell, the Chief Executive Officer of New South Wales Farmers, which is Australia's largest state farming organisation. Pete took on the role of CEO in 2018 following a significant stint with life sciences company Syngenta, working across corporate affairs and sustainability. Before that, working for the National Farmers Federation. Please make him welcome. Rod, right at the end there, you talked about what the impact or the challenges have been over that reduction, I guess, of competition over the years. Is it just legal reform that's required, or do we actually need bigger change kind of across the economy?
Very effective. Is this working now?
Yes.
Right, okay. So I think it is both. I think we need legal change in terms of merger laws and unfair practices, as I've mentioned. I think those two changes will make an enormous difference, particularly to agriculture. But it is a mindset change as well. I mean, governments have got themselves into a position where I think they're often favouring the incumbent players. For one reason or another, they get convinced that that's, what's good for General Motors is good for the economy. And so we need policy change as well. I think Inland Rail is a classic case. Is Pacific National allowed to control this thing or not? There's also issues about, do we allow airport slots for that new airline Bonza, which is a silly name, of course. Bonza, we stopped using Bonza a long time ago, but anyway, what can you do? They're Americans. But they are going to go to airports that don't, that will bring airline competition to regional towns that's not there now. But they need the slots. Will they get the slots? Big move to stop them. So the short answer is we need both.
You also touched on in your speech about the calls that you've made in the past about giving greater power to the ACCC to essentially be the one that makes the decision that can be then checked and balanced by the courts on review of the material that was before the ACCC. Do you think there's appetite to come back to that?
Oh, look, I think there is. I think both the debates on unfair practices and merger law changes, I think, are eminently winnable. There are advocates for both inside the government. I think there's advocates inside the opposition as well. Obviously, the big business won't like them. the Business Council will oppose both those changes. But I think if the argument is made, the NFF, the small business, COSBOA, and a range of other business groups get behind it. Obviously, the consumer groups are there, but I think business groups is really what matters to win these debates, to show how it actually matters to 99.9% of business when you've got 0.1 opposing it.
Pete, I'll bring you in a moment, but Rod, what do you see as the risk if we don't start looking at the reform agenda that you've outlined today, but that you have also been outlining in recent months and years?
I think we continue to experience very low productivity growth because it affects innovation, affects productivity. And as I say, it's a more convoluted story, but I do think it affects income inequality as well, which I think damages the national fabric, the social fabric. So I think you'll just see a continuing deterioration.
Pete, this is something you've also been calling for quite a while now, stronger regulation or a stronger approach to competition. Why is that needed? What are you seeing from the farmers' perspective in New South Wales?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and thanks to NFF for the chance to be here this afternoon. In reflecting on the topic, I thought about how I started my 2022, and it was early January where Australia was facing the reality of quotas on how much mince you could buy. We were seeing empty vegetable shelves in our major retailers, and soon after we saw the famous $12 lettuce, and that sort of made me reflect a little bit as I started 2022. Whether we had gone too far in terms of the concentration of power within those fresh fruit and vegetable supply chains, Dan. And certainly New South Wales Farmers is of the view we have gone too far around that consolidation of market power, both at a wholesale level, but equally at a retail level in Australia, with two major players controlling upwards of 66% of that retail grocery market. So, yeah, we think there is a need to shine a bit of a light on our perishable goods sectors particularly. We're very focused on chicken meat and horticulture, and certainly some of the reforms Rod's touched on we would see as really key steps forward in improving the balance of power and getting farmers a better seat at the table in negotiating the price for their goods and ultimately reinforcing the sustainability of our fresh food systems.
You touched there on some of the issues coming into 2022. As we're heading out of the other end of the year, are there particular commodities that you're worried about that we might see that real pinch point that as you just touched on?
Yeah, look, the ACCC's under Rod's leadership and the work of Mick Keogh did a really comprehensive inquiry into perishable goods, Dan, and it is those perishable agricultural goods that really are top of mind when we talk about these issues of competition law. The reality is if your farm produce is perishable, you've got that narrow window to capture the best value for that product. So any delays in getting that into the hands of consumers, whether they're in Australia or in export markets, really does erode that value that farmers receive. So, look, the biggest issues I'm seeing are really in the poultry meat industry. In Australia, we can buy a kilo of chicken thighs for $7, and there's a whole story behind that. But the reality is my poultry meat members really just own sheds, and they're really specialised sheds that can really only be used for growing chickens. They don't own the chickens. They don't own the feed the chickens eat. They don't own the recipes behind the nutritional design that allows chickens to grow out in the timeframes they do. They just own the sheds. So it really just captures this empower in that bargaining relationship with these chicken meat processors. And we've seen that the loss of a number of them in New South Wales. So poultry meat farmers really only have sort of 1.5 options around where they could sell their birds. So if you've got a couple of sheds that are very specially designed to grow chickens in, and you've got one person you can sell your chickens to, and you don't have any options to diversify your business, then obviously your ability to negotiate a reasonable deal around that table is very challenging. And I think that's certainly what the perishable goods inquiry identified. And we do see the need to continue to take steps forward on this, Dan, particularly as we look at mandating parts of the Food and Grocery Code to really restore some balance in some of these trading negotiations.
It's a conversation we keep coming back to as a nation around milk and milk prices, isn't it? And some of the pressure points there as well. I just want to open up to questions from the crowd. There's one just up here, and then we'll come down to Tony after that.
Thanks, Dan. Robert Hardy from New South Wales Farmers. That's how I was identified this morning, but NBN. Rod, we heard earlier today the conversation about suppliers up the supply chain refusing to accept increased costs that farmers are seeing through increased input costs on farm. What would your advice be to farmers about how they can tackle that imbalance when Coles or Woolworths, to just name a couple of businesses in this mix, who've certainly been named by New South Wales farmers, what's your advice to farmers in negotiating the increased costs they're facing and the disparate negotiation power that they have with the suppliers who potentially refuse to pay what it actually costs to produce the food?
Well, look, a really tricky issue. Obviously, there is provision for collective bargaining if they can try and do that, which I think the ACCC would facilitate very quickly. There's, of course, the Food and Grocery Code, which is frankly pretty useless because it's got no teeth. So it'd be nice if that was made useful so that there were avenues for farmers in that position you described to be able to appeal in some way. Otherwise, just jumping up and down and making a noise. But, you know, it's a very awful position to be in when in the food and grocery sector, you've got just to, you know, if you're of any size in the market, then you need to sell to Coles and or Woolworths if you're of any size at all. Now, if you're really small, you don't have to. You've got other options, but if you're of any size, you have to, and that puts them in an incredibly strong position. So that, you know, there aren't many options, but that's my best guess.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Rod. Really appreciate you coming along and giving your insights. And I know you won't be short of a gig, but I've just created a chief economist role at the NFF. If you're looking for a position, I know you're probably looking into other gigs, but let's chat after. I just want to go back to your comment about the courts interpreting the legislation and the ACCC. I find that sort of really interesting, and just a little, if you could perhaps unpack that a little bit more as to why the courts are perhaps interpreting it differently to the intent, because I agree with you. I mean, the number of cases that are going to court and it's just being knocked back, and I don't know whether it's Section 46 or what it is, but it's just, it appears as if, and it's not just the case in competition law, of course, but the courts just, that roadblock seems to be a real challenge. So I just wonder if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yes, I'll just make one public announcement. You mentioned Mick Keogh, so one other thing the NFF can do is make sure Mick gets reappointed to the ACCC. Mick is fantastic, one of the wisest people on the planet, so make sure he stays there, thanks. The issue with the courts is one of evidentiary burden, and with a merger, it hasn't happened yet. So it's hard to convince a court of what's going to happen. So you and I could sit there and say, right, okay, 3 players in the market now, number one's going to take over number 2. We know what's going to happen, right? Just commercial experience. But the court's sitting there with a blank sheet of paper saying, you provide evidence to show me what's going to happen. Now, commercial common sense tells you what's going to happen. That is to say, if they didn't raise prices and you were on the board of the company, you'd sack the chief executive for not raising the price. I mean, it's obvious what's going to happen. Everyone in this room knows, but the court insists on evidence. That is very hard to get when the merger hasn't happened. And if I could just segue one little bit, you mentioned Section 46. I mean, we lost the case again. You know, we took the New South Wales government, well, it was New South Wales Ports, the owner of Port Botany and Kembla, to court over that deal they did with the the New South Wales government to stop competition from the Port of Newcastle. The court found that that provision was there to maximise the proceeds from sale, but that did not amount to a substantial lessening of competition because the court wasn't convinced that a port at Newcastle would be profitable. Now, how do you convince them of that? So the Port of Newcastle, I'm sure everyone knows, is the biggest coal export port in the world. And the owners are sitting there thinking, well, coal, not looking too good. We're going to have to throw away the keys in whatever period. So let's go into containers. They've spent $30 million doing all the studies. They're desperately keen to do it. And so you've got this company that wants to do something, and the court's saying, no, I didn't get enough evidence that it would be profitable. I mean, so the short answer is it's the evidentiary burden they're requiring, which is just, I think, uncommercial and frankly naive.
Is it, with that evidentiary burden, is there a way to say, and this might be a naive question, but we've seen this happen over in this sector or in this similar area, isn't that enough to say this is what the pattern of behaviour will be, because boards have to act in the best interest of the shareholders or the company or whatever the factor is, to say, well, this is just the pattern?
Well, look, my honest answer is I don't think so.
Okay.
And of course, you get the merger parties turning up in the courtroom dressed extremely well, pointing out that they're doing the merger because of all these efficiency gains. Actually, the merger will allow them to reduce costs, and therefore that'll benefit consumers. So that's what they're saying. Now you come along and prove the opposite. Yeah. So commercial common sense is not evidence in a courtroom.
Dan, sorry, can I just ask a follow-up question to Rod? Because it's super interesting, right? How do you actually stop it then? The evidence is the obvious solution to the courts to help them understand what might happen from a merger. I mean, is that the only solution? The evidence? How do you actually how do you stop that process? How do you prevent the courts from taking that position?
Yeah, but my best guess is the two changes I'm advocating. Firstly, that rather than the issue be argued de novo, in the court. So just to let people understand, I mean, so the ACCC, there's an informal merger system. The ACCC lets parties know whether it's going to try and challenge the merger in court or not, and so they come and ask us. There's no merger approval system. They don't have to seek our approval. They don't even have to let us know the merger's occurring, right? The law just says don't have a merger if it's going to substantial lessening competition. So they come and ask us, look, if we go ahead, are you going to challenge it in court? Now, there are a number of times when we say, yes, we will, when they go away, because they just can't wait for that to play out. So there are mergers that are stopped. There are mergers where they give us undertakings to address the harm. So it's not as if the thing's useless. But the problem is, when they can wait, they've got all the time in the world. They do go to court, then 99% of the time they win and we lose. So the changes I'm talking about are firstly that we are the decision maker. You just appeal the decision we've made, and we write down that decision, and that decision has in it a bit of commercial logic, backed up by a few experts saying, this is what's happened over here, this is what's happened over there. So, in a sense, the evidence before the court is in the ACCC's decision. And you've got to come along and show why what the ACCC concluded is wrong. Completely different ballgame to the one we've got now. And then the second one is that if you've got substantial market power, and more than one company in a market can have substantial market power, if you've got substantial market power, then, and we just then would have to show that it would either be entrenched, substantially increased, or substantially extended, and then it's deemed to substantially lessen competition. So it just lowers the evidentiary burden. So both those elements, I think, will help a lot.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Yeah, just over here. And then there's one up there.
I might just ask one myself.
Sorry,
I've got the microphone.
Sorry.
Isn't that cheating?
Unfair advantage.
Yeah. Rod, over in New Zealand, they went through a review of their food systems as well with regard to competition, and seemed to be setting the scene around potentially breaking up the duopoly over there, but ultimately balked at the end of that particular process. I'm just wondering if you've got any views on whether the reforms you're suggesting here go far enough, or whether there's a case in Australia for government taking perhaps a more dramatic step in breaking up those existing sort of market power structures. Just your observations and comments on that would be great.
Oh, look, good question, tricky question. Alan Fells, my predecessor, one removed, is a very strong advocate for breaking up and having a divestiture power. You'd obviously have to go to the courts and show certain things, and then there's the power of the courts to order divestiture. I guess my view's always been that there'd always be these constant demands for divestiture here, there and everywhere, and it'd get a bit messy. But look, it's a debate to be had. Alan is very keen on it. He's been around a long time. I'll keep an open mind.
Hi, Sarah from Farmers Business Network. This is regarding the grain growers of Australia. There is rumour that there isn't enough competition in marketing their grain, and ACCC may be looking into this. A question for you both is, do you think it is uncompetitive, the market for growers to sell their grain in Australia? Like, is there anti-competitive behaviour going on? Or do you believe it's due to our supply chain and the anti-competitive behaviour that may be there, or the restrictions in regards to access to port?
Well, I think there is a problem. I mean, there's obviously monopoly export ports in WA, South Australia, and in parts of the East Coast. And in that case, marketing is by and large done by the monopoly port owner. So they dominate the buying. Usually they've got facilities upstream as well for collecting the grain and sending it down to the port. So I think the correlation between the percentage of grain marketed through the company that owns the monopoly ports, which is sometimes 80% or whatever, it's very high, and yet they don't have that percent where somebody else is the owner, I think means that we've got a problem, and therefore the farmers aren't really getting a competitive price for their grain because one party has an enormous advantage and takes advantage of that.
Happy to build on that, Dan. New South Wales Farmers has certainly supported Grain Producers Australia's call for an ACCC market study into the grain market for the points that Rod's touched on. Certainly worth a look, but I mean the infrastructure piece is very real. 40% of the farm gate costs for a grain farmer in Australia come down to shipping and logistics, just getting grain from farm to port. So we're doing a lot of work around how we can improve efficiencies in that cost path for grain from farm to export ports. And certainly the Port of Newcastle bill that got through the New South Wales Parliament a couple of weeks back under the leadership of Greg Piper from Lake Macquarie and Adam Marshall will be a game changer for my members up in the northwest, like Fiona, like Xavier Martin, our president, giving that direct access into Newcastle, not having to go through the challenges of getting into Port Botany in containers or potentially some of the other dramas around Kembla to the south for different reasons. So continuing to sort of work on improving our grain logistics will be absolutely critical, and obviously some of the recent statistics we've seen on the Australian waterfront are things we can't really be proud of. There's certainly room for improvement there, working with all the parties around that discussion, but the reality is this is a huge cost to our farmers, and we need to really focus in on how we can drive those efficiencies.
I think there was a question just up the back there.
Hi, I'm Chloe from Ozveg. So part of the issues I see lie in like policy, whether it's the food and grocery code or the unfair practices. But part of the other issue I see is that growers fear sticking their neck out and sort of saying to buyers or retailers that like their prices are unfair. So there's in the Food and Grocery Code Independent Arbiter report, well, that was one of the biggest issues and roadblocks for growers to come forward. So what other things other than, you know, breaking up a duopoly do you see as a solution? Whether it's making the Food and Grocery Code mandatory, is it price transparency, is it collective bargaining? What else can growers do?
Well, I think improving the Food and Grocery Code is essential. I mean, it's extremely weak. If I remember correctly, and I may not, but one of the stages I think you have to go through is a point of contact or an adjudicator or something that works for the supermarkets. Well, that's not going to work. And there's a whole range of... there's just not much teeth. It's easily avoided. So I think it needs to be mandatory, but I think the provisions need to be toughened up. That would help a lot. And then, yes, collective bargaining when you can. But I think for the problems you're talking about, strengthening the Food and Grocery Code, roughly along the lines of the way the ACCC was arguing, and we lost that debate comprehensively, would make the biggest difference.
Dan, happy to just make a few remarks on that very real issue. And I mean, there's stories that my members have shared with myself and with our Executive Council. They are genuinely in fear of retribution if they take a stand on these issues, or they raise some of the realities of the contractual relationships they're in. And that's why we don't see a lot of these stories being shared. So we're seeing a lot of corporates talk a lot about ESG, and we've touched on some of those themes earlier today. I think we do need to look at the S in ESG being the social side of our food systems, and these big food powerhouses need to look a bit more deeply into their supply relationships. We've seen a reality where the major retailers have sort of really consolidated their supplier base, so they have a small number of relationships with very large either farmers or aggregators that aggregate fresh food products from a much wider array of farm businesses, typically family farm businesses. And so the relationships with that first tier, not that second tier of the wider network, and the people that are really on the receiving end of these market power imbalances are the people at that second tier. So, look, I think we need to look to some of these retailers and other supply chain players, whether they're meat processors or chicken processors, and ask them to sort of walk the talk on ESG and think a bit more deeply around the social consequences of the business models they're running, because there's some really tragic stories I'm hearing, and it's a deep shame that farmers are being treated like that in a country like Australia.
Well, there's another question just up there in the row in front.
Thanks very much, Tony York. Just for Rod, perhaps just to comment, in terms of the discussion about the inequity of market power in the agricultural supply sector and the retail and the food chain, farmers historically have looked back and said, well, co-ops, and I'll market my produce through a co-op, has been one mechanism that they have used in the past and still do in a few examples. But I wonder if you'd like to comment why that doesn't seem to be as effective now, or or could it still be in terms of compensating for that market inequity in market power?
Look, I'm not sure. I really don't have a very good answer to that question. I can only go back to talking about the ability to collectively bargain, which I think can be used more than it is now. But cooperatives, I guess that was, if I remember correctly, and others might have a comment, that you know, they are often getting the produce and they could become fairly relaxed and comfortable, and they may not have been as efficient, which is probably why they reduced. But it certainly gave the farmers more ability to control a part of the supply chain. So look, it may be an option, but you could do you can do that effectively, I think, through collective bargaining if people wanted to. But sorry, I don't have a very good answer for your question.
Look, I think it's certainly worth a deeper look at the role cooperatives can play, and two examples stick really high in my mind in terms of New South Wales Farmers members. Firstly, the Oz Group co-op at Coffs Harbour there, who are a group of blueberry growers that were a bit unhappy with their market treatment, so they got together and bought an old Bunnings and really invested through a co-op in a really advanced processing plant for blueberries, supplying into the major retailers, but equally doing a bit of exporting as well. So I think there's opportunities like that, particularly driven by the realities of things like labour supply that I think we do need to really look at more deeply. Another really great example that I caught up with at Primex is the Northern Cooperative Meat Company, who are out of Casino there. And look, that's the only abattoir in New South Wales that a farmer can take their own beasts to and have them contract killed, so they can retain the ownership of that meat and then can then market that meat with their own story behind it and capture some additional value that they wouldn't necessarily get if they were selling into one of the major processing players. So there's definitely opportunities here, Tony. It'd be remiss not mentioning CBH in the West, which is a really wonderful model, not without its challenges, but certainly the envy of a few East Coast growers at certain times. But look, yeah, there's certainly something in that co-op space, and the Co-ops Federation and the Business Council for Co-ops and Mutuals are both doing a really good job rowing the boat for reforms to make it easier for co-ops to play a role.
And I think that's a perfect place to leave it on. Thanks so much to Rod and Peter. Rod Sims AO is the professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU, and Peter Arkell is CEO of New South Wales Farmers. Please give them both a round of applause.